Good morning. After Jesus abandoned the tomb and his resurrection became news and apparent to everyone, after the cat was out of the bag, people were all left with the same question. Now what? The question took a few different forms. You might have sounded somewhat different in the particulars, but the general point was the same. What happens next now that Jesus is back from the dead? What happens now when we die? If Jesus came back from the dead, do we? Will I stay dead? When will I come back? He came back 3 days later. Is that true for all of us? What do we do now with our understanding of how the universe works? The very laws of physics and nature don't seem to apply anymore. How much has changed? What do we do now with religion and the debates about life after death? And even the apostles kept asking Jesus in those days, what happens next? Where do we go from here? What should we expect? Nobody seemed to know what the future held when he left the tomb. For just a moment this morning, place yourselves in some first century shoes and feel that confusion before you try to explain it all away. Don't rationalize it. Don't say we've figured all that mess in the last 2,000 years. Just sit in that tension of not knowing what happens next for one sermon. Following Jesus meant a certain kind of thing. It looked a certain kind of way. Before the crucifixion, before the resurrection, being a follower of Jesus was definable. It was tangible. It was understandable. It was knowable. Being his follower meant some occasional travel. It meant listening to some sermons, bringing your sick friends and family for healing when Jesus came to town. Being a follower meant that if you were super dedicated and one of those top 72, I guess that was the original blue check mark. If you were one of the first top 72, you might even be sent out with a partner to do some of the things that Jesus was doing, to give some sermons, to pass on some knowledge, and perform some miracles too, all under his authority, but that's what you did. In those early days, you weren't confused about who or what you were. You were still Jewish. You still ate kosher foods. You still kept the Sabbath. You worshiped at the temple. Nothing had changed, except that Jesus was the new preacher in town. He talked different. He looked different. He acted different, but it was still the same world that you lived in. Jesus had a different interpretation style when it came to understanding Torah. He taught it differently than everybody else had before him, with a different set of authority. But the whole movement itself of whatever Jesus was doing, it still fit within Judaism and everything that you had known for thousands of years. Even Jesus said that he came to fulfill Torah, not to destroy it or tear it down. But now, after the resurrection, well, now the apostles are changing that situation, challenging it, moving you out of the world you've always been part of. They're talking about freedom from Torah. They're talking about inclusion of the Gentiles into God's people. And that makes a person wonder, what changed? And what will life be like as a follower of Jesus apart from Torah? They hadn't been doing that up to this point, up to the tomb, up to this resurrection business. They were still within those comfortable parameters, and now those comfortable parameters have been ripped asunder, and there seem to be no boundaries anymore for defining what is life, what are people. It was an existential moment to wonder for the first time who you are as a person and where you fit when following Jesus suddenly changes your way of life. It changes your culture. It changes your religion. Following Jesus meant everything was in upheaval. So Peter writes a letter. He senses, he feels this confusion, this tension. He writes to help guide you into some new way of life. And first he tells you that you were ransomed from the futile ways of your ancestors by the blood of Christ. Ransomed. How can you be ransomed when you didn't even know you were being held hostage? Didn't we skip a step? Who took us hostage? Who was holding us all this time? Ransomed from what? From whom? We know this language of ransom today from some of our hymns, from some of our worship music, and we tend to think of that exclusively as ransom from sin and death. But the table was really full of a lot of questions when Peter writes this sentence. What ransom are we talking about? And regrettably, you have options for what to do with this. Peter said you've been ransomed from the futile ways of your ancestors. 3 sermons diverged in a confused preacher, and he chooses the one less traveled by. I regret this choice immensely. You all have permission to check out and play on your phone until I'm done. You'll know I'm done by the standing and singing bit, and I would prefer it that way. I cannot stand this sermon, but I can't escape it. Here we are. If you are a Jewish person sitting in synagogue and you hear Peter's words about being ransomed from the inheritance of the futility of your ancestors, the first thing you're going to think of is Torah. What if Peter means you've been ransomed from Torah? That's terrifying, to be ransomed from your own religious code. We do have an option here. We have 3 options, really. You can go on reading 1 Peter 1:18 the way that's comfortable for all of us, the way that I wish I would have done anyway, but didn't, and assume that he's meaning something about sin, that the inheritance of your ancestors is sin. Now, you have to admit some things that are going to make you uncomfortable to keep reading that. You're going to have to use some terms that you would typically avoid, like original sin or some kind of concept of the inheritance of sin. You're going to have to carry that baggage along to keep reading 1 Peter 1:18 that way. You can do it. You can have that sermon. I wish I would have given it. That this means that Peter's telling us that your sinfulness before Christ was all futility. That makes sense. It's true. It's good. It's scriptural. It's fine. There's a case to be made for that's exactly what Peter means here. You can also read this a different way and say that Peter is talking to an exclusively Gentile audience, and the futility of their ancestors has everything to do with their paganism from before Christ. They used to worship other gods. They used to live by other morality codes. They used to do other religious things, and it was all futile compared to Christ. That's possible too, as long as you don't read the opening verses of Peter, where he addresses this whole thing to the God's people scattered in the diaspora, the Jewish people. So if you want to avoid all that, you can figure that out in your head and try to argue it out with yourselves, and I didn't want to preach that sermon either. The third option, though, really is, what if he is addressing a Jewish people, and he's referring to Torah as something of a futile inheritance? What does that look like? What does that mean? I'd hate to be the person who had to read this letter in church all those years ago for the very first time, because I don't think you could get through this part of the letter without a barrage of questions and comments. I imagine 1 Peter 1:18 was the stopping point for that sermon, and there was much debate over what does he mean, what futility, what inheritance, what is it that our ancestors have given us that's so futile? Explain this to me. I imagine the crowd would have interjected to say that this couldn't be right because it can't be Torah. Torah can't be the ransomer. It can't be the jailer. The law is not the hostage taker. No, Torah was the helpful guide that helped people live into the blessings of God. Why would anyone need to be ransomed from something as good as law? But I also imagine there were a few people there who would answer back about how restrictive Torah had become, how exclusive it was, how it prevented Gentiles from being included into God's people and into God's kingdom. Someone in the crowd would inevitably speak of the burden of Torah. They could quote Paul, who they just heard recently in the northern regions of Galatia, where he described Torah as something cumbersome, impossible. Paul even went as far as to call it a curse. Torah, can you imagine? A curse. And now Peter, futile inheritance? Where does that leave someone like me? This is the question Jewish followers of Jesus were struggling with. They didn't ask for this. They didn't want to deal with this mess, but here they are sitting in synagogue on a nice Saturday, and all of a sudden, perhaps Torah is futile. Torah told me who God is. Torah helps me understand how to be in relationship with God. But if Torah really did imprison me, and Jesus ransoms me from that burden, then what do I have left? Who am I without Torah? And who is God? Terrifying questions. I hope that whoever read the letter that day got to finish the paragraph, at the very least. Peter continues. He says, through Jesus, you have come to trust in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and your hope are set on God. And everyone would have rallied and said, yes, but that's what Torah did for us. Torah taught us to trust in God. Torah gave us faith and hope in God. And Peter says, no, you once knew God through the law, but now you know God through Jesus. That's what's changed. Through his death and resurrection, you know God. You trust God. God proves his trustworthiness, his faithfulness in that death and in that resurrection. To be ransomed from Torah is to know God through Christ, not just words. His crucifixion, his resurrection, his action of his life, his death, his new life, this is where you place your faith and your hope now. That's what's new. That's what comes next. God is no longer the holder of a covenant made centuries ago, but God is now known in the very real life of Jesus. That's what's new now. That's what comes next. Which means that Jesus is now the lens through which you understand who you are. All the things that Torah once did for you, Jesus now does. Jesus is how you understand who you are. It's how you understand who God is and how to be in a relationship with God. It's like Jesus always said, if you know me, then you know the Father. If you've seen me, then you've seen the one who sent me. And this doesn't make Torah obsolete. It doesn't make Torah useless. But it means that Torah is no longer the sole source of knowing God. It doesn't hold that monopoly anymore. Because Jesus is how we know God now. And Jesus is also now how we know who we are as a people of God. Which brings Peter to his so that. Anytime you find a so that or an in order that in Scripture, you need to rearrange what you've read to see everything differently. That's the culminating point in which everything that comes before and everything that comes after hinges and balances. A so that means that the several sentences that came before all serve the purpose of leading you to the thing that comes next. It's the aha moment. It's the purpose clause. It's the in order that. Okay, Peter just now gets to his so that. So if you can make it through the first several verses of this paragraph and get to the so that, it all kind of starts to make some sense, I think. Peter gives you his so that you have genuine mutual love. Love one another deeply from the heart. And everything he's said so far has been leading up to this point. Of all the points he could have made, this is the one he hinges and stakes everything. This is what is different now that Jesus has been crucified. This is what's different now that Jesus has abandoned the tomb and left it empty. Now, in these days, you know God through Jesus. And through Jesus, you now know how to truly love one another. His life, his death, his resurrection, all three show us the very heart of God and teach us what it is to genuinely love one another. And the world will know us by our love for one another. This is the answer to the now what question. What do we do now that Jesus is resurrected? You love one another. Genuinely, mutually, deeply from the heart, you love. Which kind of makes you feel like you weren't doing it right before that. If somebody has to tell you to start loving, it assumes that they think you weren't doing it right to begin with, doesn't it? You don't tell somebody to love if they're already doing it. You say, keep on with that. That's a good job, guys. Good game. No, you say this because something's different about how you love one another. What's different? You've seen what love looks like now for the very first time. If there's just one thing, and I think there's many, but if there's just one thing that the incarnated life of Jesus can show us that Torah never could, if there's just one thing that Jesus could demonstrate that words never really could, it's what it feels like to be loved. There is something about knowing Jesus, experiencing that man, that made you feel what genuine love really felt like, in a way that worship had never done, in a way that the laws never could teach, in a way that doing the right things because you have to do the right things could ever make you feel. There is something about this Jesus that if you really know him, then you really understand what it means to be loved for the first time in a completely unique kind of way. And so if you want to know what you do now that the tomb is empty, now that you truly know what love looks like, you love one another. You change how you treat one another. You change how you see one another. Because this means, if you really buy into all of this life and death and resurrection business, this truly does mean that if you think God sent his son to die for the whole world, that really does mean that the person who hates you and wishes you dead is also loved by God in the same way that you are loved by God. And what do you do with that? There's no room in Torah for that. Torah made concessions and it made exceptions for things to do with that. You have heard that it was said eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, you have to love your enemy now because you've been loved. And you've heard that it was said to be angry. I tell you, don't even be angry. You've heard that it was said to be kind. I tell you to be kind to your enemies, to love those who hate you, to pray for those who persecute you. Because when you look at that other person, now that you've seen love die and come back from an empty tomb, now that you know what love really looks like, you also know without a shadow of a doubt that the person who you don't want to love is loved by God the same way that you are loved by God. And how can you ever live in a world like that? It changes everything. There are no favorites in this game. There's no God's people and everybody else anymore. The boundaries are open. Everyone is God's people, whether you like it or not. And no matter how much you protest, it's not going to change that. Torah didn't have room for that kind of an idea. It held you ransomed to a smaller way of thinking about the world, and now it's blown wide open. God's love isn't limited to a certain people who follow certain rules. God's love is now available and open to all, because one man died for the sins of all. And one person became God's righteousness for all. Not once for some people for one generation, but once for all time. This is so much bigger now that you know Jesus, now that you see this life, this death, this resurrection, now that you've really come to see the fullness of the love of God. You have no choice except to love one another. And now fast forward 2,000 years. What have you seen? How much love have you seen? How much pain have you seen? How much suffering have you seen? How much genuine mutual love have you experienced in your life? Is it a rare gem, or is it something you have with everyone? Have you peaked? Have you arrived? Have you found the love of Christ in every relationship you've ever had? I haven't. Oh, I wanted to avoid this sermon. I should have just done the easier one. But how amazing would it be to truly take these words into heart and to truly look upon the cross and look inside an empty tomb and see the fullness of the love of God and choose to reflect that back out to everyone else around me. What a wonderful place that would be to live. We see glimpses of it from every now and then, don't we? We find pockets of this fullness of love. We have close relationships in which we can rely on this. We see the love of Christ in one another. We see the love of Christ in the lives of many of you who sacrifice your time that you don't have to keep things running here. I see the love of Christ in the sacrifice of Sunday worship. We don't often talk about this because it's kind of that elephant in the room we'd rather not talk about. But let's be honest for a few minutes, then we can go back to being dishonest if you want. To get here on a Sunday morning for worship is a sacrifice. It is. It's not that it's inconvenient. It is a sacrifice of a certain kind. There is a sacrifice to worship in order to get here, in order to worship. It requires sacrifice. It requires the rearranging of your schedule. And that isn't trivial. It's difficult. It's very difficult. And we find the love of Christ in the sacrifices that many of us make just to make sure that this all happens on a Sunday morning. That's not insignificant. It's grandiose. It's the love of Christ at its fullest. I truly believe that. Think about all the components that it takes to make this happen, the preparations, the last-minute changes, the people involved in this mechanism of worship, and you find the fullness of the love of Christ. And not just here in worship, in your friendships, in your family, you have people who show you the fullness of the love of Christ. You have those people in your life who, no matter how you mess up, they know you messed up, they'll tell you messed up, and they're still going to love you the same anyway. That's the fullness of the love of Christ. Anytime you experience that grace that you didn't deserve, it's the fullness of the love of Christ. Anytime you give that to someone else, it's the fullness of the love of Christ. What's different now? When people get baptized, it's been my professional experience. All this has been getting us to this one story. It's my professional experience that there are conversations that happen before a baptism and there are conversations that happen after a baptism. And they're very similar in some ways and they're very different in others. In post-baptism conversations, it is surprisingly common for somebody to ask the same question that these Christians are asking of 1 Peter. What happens now? Like there's a lot of build-up and a lot of hype before a baptism. There's a lot of things to do, right? There's things you got to know, there's things you got to say, there's things you got to believe, you got to do. There's an order of operations and a build-up and a build-up and a build-up, and then you get baptized, and then what? There's kind of this cliff moment where all of a sudden you look down and you see just this endlessness of what happens next. Life with Jesus, what does that mean? It's the same question that they're asking here in 1 Peter, what happens next? And we overcomplicate that mess. We always overcomplicate it, and we make it too off limits, too exclusive, too hard to obtain. Well, there's this list of things you've got to do and this list of things you've got to not do. And now you have to have that magically downloaded in your head. And if you don't, you have to at least pretend like you know it all because everybody expects you to know it all. And you've got to behave a certain way, and you've got to do a certain thing at church, and you've got to have a perfect attendance record, or at least have an excused absence form to fill out if you miss a Sunday. And there's this list of things that happens after baptism, but it's too complicated that way. Peter simplifies the whole thing and says, after you've encountered the love of Christ, there's only one thing left to do: love one another. Genuinely, mutually, deeply from the heart, love one another. And the rest will sort itself out. It always sorts itself out. Don't overthink it. Don't overthink your attendance record at church. Don't overthink whether you volunteer enough. Don't overthink whether or not you're doing things right or doing things wrong. Just keep it simple. Love one another. That's always the answer you should get after a baptism. That's always the answer you should give somebody who asks you the now what question. Somebody who's been a Christian their entire life, on their deathbed at the age of 132, the answer should still be love one another. And it's going to take you that long to figure out how to do it right. And you're not always going to do it right. But you keep coming back to the love of Christ, and you're going to learn how to do it slowly but surely. It's the importance of this meal that we take every week. We come to this table every week to come back to see the love of Christ, because we so easily forget what it looks like to love like Christ. You come to this table and you see love, so that whenever you go back out into this world with one another, you can love the way that He has loved us. Don't overthink this. Don't make it too complicated. That's why you've been ransomed. Torah overcomplicated things unnecessarily, and not by itself, but just with what we did with it, how we treated it, how we handled Torah became a burden that you could never, ever keep on your own. It was overcomplicating this unnecessarily. So you've been set free from Torah so that you can do what it was trying to do all along. You've been set free to love one another the way that Christ has loved you, the way that God has loved you through Christ. And it's moments like that that make my job seem meaningless, because it really is just that simple. And every week I stand up here and say something that's more or less a variation of that, because that's it. That really is, it's the only message I've got to deliver. It's the same thing every week. I just put it in a different case and polish it differently and return it, but it's just the same story over and over again. You just find the love of Christ, you accept it, and you return it to one another. But I am the first to admit that is the hardest thing in the world to do. For some, that might mean it's hard for you to accept that Christ could love you so unconditionally. And so I'll keep standing up here week after week to tell you that you really are worth loving. And for others, it might be difficult to love certain people in your life who have wronged you so horrendously that you think it's impossible to ever love them the way that Christ might, or to accept that Christ could love them. And so I'll stand up here every week and walk that journey with you as I carry my list of people who I find it difficult to love too. And we'll come together at this table and we'll gaze upon the love of God and the crucifixion, the death and resurrection of Jesus, and remind one another what it is to love. And we'll do it again next week. Same bat time, same bat place. Just over and over again. You've been set free. You've been set free from the burdens of having to do things a certain way, of law, of sin and death. You've been set free into this world to return the love of God to one another. What a beautiful, life-changing way of life. What a beautiful vision of what the world could be. Let's stand and sing.